England, December 1838. Christmas Eve settled over London with a deceptive calm, the kind that softened edges without removing danger. Snow from the night before still clung to the city in uneven layers, masking the filth beneath with a fragile illusion of order. Gas lamps flickered to life as daylight faded, casting warm halos over streets that remained restless and overcrowded. London, even when dressed for celebration, never truly slept. Berkeley Square had been transformed into a public spectacle meant to inspire goodwill and nostalgia. Evergreen garlands stretched between lampposts, their needles heavy with frost. Vendors lined the square in dense rows, offering roasted chestnuts, spiced wine, ribbons, fabrics, sweets and ornaments intended to evoke generosity rather than calculation. The air carried competing scents of cinnamon, pine, smoke, damp wool, and the unavoidable residue of horse traffic that no decoration could fully disguise. The fair appeared charming from a distance. Up close it was loud, compressed, and volatile. Henry Ashbourne, Duke of Northmore, moved through the crowd with visible restraint. His posture reflected long familiarity with public scrutiny and an even longer practice of minimizing exposure to it. He was not a man who blended easily into crowds, nor did he attempt to. His presence carried authority without display, an economy of movement shaped by discipline rather than ease. For years, Henry had adhered to a personal framework designed to survive the London social season with minimal disruption. It was not recorded, but it was enforced with precision. He avoided environments engineered for emotional excess. He declined gatherings where sentimentality replaced reason, and he ensured at all times that he was never placed in circumstances that could be interpreted as improper, particularly those involving unmarried women. Reputation, once compromised, did not recover cleanly. He understood this better than most. His presence at the Mayfair Christmas Fair was therefore an anomaly. Attendance had been secured through insistence rather than inclination. His sister, Lady Margaret Thornbury, had applied her influence with characteristic efficiency, presenting the outing as a non-negotiable obligation. Henry's compliance was strategic rather than willing. He intended to fulfill expectations, make a visible charitable gesture, and withdraw before exposure became risk. He monitored time closely. By the 47th minute, nothing remarkable had occurred. He had navigated the perimeter of the square, acknowledged acquaintances without invitation to linger, and examined stalls with superficial interest. He positioned himself near an exit route, maintaining distance from clusters known for social maneuvering. At a ribbon merchant's display, he paused long enough to consider a purchase that would satisfy appearances while committing him to nothing further. It was at that moment that the sequence of events shifted. The initial disturbance registered not as sound, but as displacement, a subtle change in the space behind him. When Henry turned, the situation was already unfolding. A young woman stood among the crowd, her balance visibly compromised. Her posture wavered, then collapsed entirely. There was no hesitation, no attempt to steady herself. Gravity claimed her without negotiation. Henry reacted before calculation intervened. He stepped forward and intercepted her fall, absorbing weight he had not anticipated. The motion was uncoordinated, the timing imperfect. An accessory swung upward and struck his jaw with force. Her bonnet detached and disappeared into the surrounding merchandise. The ground beneath his feet offered little traction, and the two bodies shifted laterally, drawing immediate attention. The woman remained unconscious. What might have passed as a private medical incident instead became public spectacle. The surrounding crowd reacted with collective urgency that rapidly evolved into conjecture. Observations multiplied, interpretations formed without confirmation. The absence of context invited assumption. Henry refused to relinquish his hold. Lowering Her to the ground would have resolved the immediate physical difficulty, but the implications were unacceptable. Her clothing alone indicated status and care. Leaving her exposed on the street invited narratives beyond correction. Around them, voices overlapped. Concern blended with fascination. Time extended. Henry asserted control where structure remained possible. He identified the situation as a medical collapse and demanded that her companion be located. None emerged. The absence intensified scrutiny. Details of her attire were dissected. Her unfamiliar styling marked her as foreign. Speculation expanded to fill the silence. With each passing second, the situation deteriorated. Henry recognized the shift before it fully materialized. The crowd no longer waited for explanation. It was generating its own. Delay would surrender authority entirely. He made a decision that aligned with propriety while guaranteeing complication. He announced his intention to transport the woman to his residence and summon medical assistance. The declaration imposed order. Approval followed, though not without undertones that suggested entertainment rather than relief. The solution was appropriate. It was also irrevocable. His carriage arrived promptly. The transfer required coordination under pressure, accompanied by unsolicited guidance and increasingly animated commentary. Henry focused on execution, ensuring the woman was moved without further harm. Only when the carriage doors closed did the immediate scrutiny dissolve. As the carriage departed, the environment changed. Witnesses were replaced by silence. The enclosed space sharpened awareness. Henry now shared proximity with an unconscious stranger whose identity remained unknown, whose condition was unresolved, and whose presence violated the boundaries he had preserved with care. He observed her without interpretation. Her breathing was steady. Her features suggested resilience rather than fragility. No ring marked her hand. The absence registered, though he refused to pursue its implications. Northmoor House emerged from the snowfall with its characteristic severity. The structure reflected its owner's preferences, symmetry, restraint, and resistance to excess. Inside, the household responded with trained discretion. Instructions were issued efficiently. A guest suite was prepared, medical assistance summoned, inquiries dispatched back to the fair. The physician arrived within the hour. His examination was thorough and clinically reassuring. No visible injury, no fever, vital signs strong and regular. The collapse, he suggested, resulted from exhaustion, shock, or physical strain. Prolonged unconsciousness was unusual but not unprecedented. Recovery was expected, though the timing remained uncertain. The practical concerns appeared resolved, others remained. Henry stood in the corridor outside the guest suite after the physician departed. The woman lay undisturbed, her presence now integrated into the structure of his household. Outside, snow continued to fall, muting the city while concealing its appetite for rumor. Inside, Northmoor House contained an element it had not been designed to accommodate. The woman did not wake, and with each hour that passed, the consequences of her eventual consciousness became more unpredictable, extending far beyond the walls of the house. Night passed slowly over Grosvenor Square. Snow continued to fall in thin, persistent layers, muting the usual sounds of the city while doing nothing to restrain its appetite for speculation. Within Northmoor House, activity followed a quieter rhythm. Servants moved with deliberate care, voices lowered, routines adjusted around the presence of an unexpected guest whose identity remained uncertain. The woman did not regain consciousness. Hours after her arrival, the guest suite remained unchanged. Lamps were kept low, fires were maintained at a steady warmth. Mrs. Davies, the housekeeper, checked the woman's condition at regular intervals, noting no change beyond the predictable patterns of sleep. Her breathing stayed even. Her complexion remained stable. There were no outward signs of distress, yet the prolonged unconsciousness itself became a concern that could not be dismissed. Henry Ashbourne did not retire early. He withdrew to his study, but rest proved elusive. His attention shifted repeatedly toward the corridor leading to the east wing, despite his effort to maintain distance. Responsibility required vigilance. Curiosity complicated it. He occupied himself with correspondence and estate reports, yet the familiar order of ledgers and figures failed to settle his thoughts. The events of the evening replayed with uncomfortable clarity, not as spectacle, but as consequence. By morning, the household was alert. Dawn arrived pale and indistinct, filtered through snowfall that showed no intention of stopping. Northmoor House greeted the day as it always did, with discipline and structure, but subtle adjustments betrayed the disruption. Breakfast was delayed. Instructions were modified. Inquiries sent the previous night had not yet produced results. No companion had been located. Reports from Berkeley Square confirmed the same absence. No individual had come forward to claim responsibility for the woman. No lodging house had reported a missing guest. No constable had recorded a disturbance that matched the description. The woman's collapse had been visible, yet her identity remained isolated from context. The physician's guidance was followed precisely. The woman was kept warm, undisturbed, and under observation. Mrs. Davies supervised her care with professional competence, ensuring propriety was maintained at every stage. Her clothing had been removed only to the extent required for comfort and examination, folded carefully and set aside. The quality of the garments suggested wealth and deliberate taste, though not conformity to English fashion. The embroidery and cut reinforced the assumption of foreign origin. Late in the morning, the first change occurred. The woman stirred. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture that suggested returning awareness. Mrs. Davies was present when her breathing altered, becoming slightly irregular before settling again. Within minutes, her eyes opened. Consciousness returned gradually, without urgency or panic. The woman remained still, her gaze unfocused as she adjusted to unfamiliar surroundings. The room presented itself without explanation. High ceilings, restrained decoration, carefully chosen furnishings that reflected permanence rather than display. Confusion followed. She attempted to orient herself, lifting her head slightly before settling back against the pillows. The absence of pain was notable. What replaced it was uncertainty. The surroundings did not align with memory. The bed was unfamiliar. The room exceeded any reasonable expectation of private lodging. Mrs. Davies approached without haste. The housekeeper identified herself, explained the circumstances in measured terms, and offered reassurance without embellishment. The woman listened attentively, absorbing information without interruption. She did not dispute the account. Instead, she exhibited a focused stillness, as though testing each detail against an internal framework that resisted alignment. Her name emerged without difficulty. She identified herself as Lady Catalina de Monteayor. The title and surname were delivered with certainty. Her origin followed naturally. She was Spanish from Seville. These details remained intact, firmly anchored in memory. What did not emerge was context. When asked about the events surrounding her collapse, Catalina hesitated. The fair itself was present in her recollection, the crowd, the pressure of proximity, the physical strain. Beyond that point, memory fractured. She recalled no fall, no rescue, no carriage. The transition from public space to private residence had vanished entirely. The absence was not selective, it was complete. More troubling was the uncertainty surrounding her companion. Catalina acknowledged traveling with another woman, yet the name surfaced slowly, as if retrieved from a distance. She expressed concern without panic, an unease grounded more in expectation than recollection. The idea of being alone at the fair did not align with intention, yet no explanation presented itself. Mrs. Davies informed her of the ongoing search. The confirmation that no companion had yet been found produced a visible response. Catalina's composure remained intact, but the absence of explanation created a palpable tension. It was not fear, but displacement. Something essential was missing, and its absence resisted definition. Henry was informed immediately. He approached the guest suite with restraint, mindful of propriety and circumstance. His entry was formal, his presence controlled. He acknowledged her consciousness with visible relief, though he avoided unnecessary familiarity. His concern manifested through measured inquiry rather than expression. Catalina received him with courtesy. Despite confusion, her demeanor was composed. She expressed gratitude for his intervention and acknowledged the inconvenience her condition had caused. The exchange established clarity without intimacy. Facts were presented, assumptions avoided. Henry confirmed the physician's assessment and reiterated the steps taken to locate her companion. He asked carefully about her purpose in London, hoping the information might guide further inquiry. The question yielded uncertainty. Catalina attempted to respond, but the answer did not arrive. She described her journey from Spain, the arrangements made by her family, and her arrival in the city. Beyond that, purpose dissolved into indistinct fragments. The absence unsettled her more than the unfamiliar setting. The discussion concluded without resolution. Mrs. Davies suggested rest and nourishment, following the physician's guidance. Catalina accepted the recommendation without resistance. Henry withdrew, leaving instructions that he be notified of any change. The distance restored order, but not clarity. Breakfast was arranged later that morning. Catalina was escorted through Northmoor House with discretion, introduced only to spaces appropriate for a guest. The environment reflected continuity and authority, qualities that contrasted sharply with her internal disorientation. She observed without comment, absorbing details with a deliberate calm that masked the effort required to maintain it. In the morning room, sustenance was provided. Catalina ate minimally, more out of obligation than appetite. The conversation remained practical. Henry avoided intrusion. Yet, the exchange revealed differences in perspective that neither attempted to conceal. His structured approach to responsibility contrasted with her direct assessments, delivered without deference to expectation. Confirmation from her hotel arrived shortly thereafter. The Claridges acknowledged her registration, along with that of a companion, identified as Señorita Elena Vasquez. The confirmation resolved one uncertainty while amplifying another. Elena's absence at the fair remained unexplained. Reports indicated concern, but also inconsistency. The role of chaperone appeared to have been neglected. Catalina defended her companion instinctively, though without evidence. Loyalty surfaced. Before explanation, Henry noted the response without comment. A decision followed. Catalina expressed the intention to remain at Northmoor House temporarily, citing recovery. The reasoning aligned with medical guidance, yet the choice carried additional weight. Remaining preserved stability, while answers remained unavailable. Departing would introduce variables neither party could yet manage. Henry agreed. The arrangement was framed as necessity rather than preference. Propriety was observed, the household adjusted accordingly. Yet beneath the formal structure, the situation developed complexity. As the day progressed, inquiries continued without result. No further information emerged. Regarding the events at the fair, no explanation accounted for Elena's absence at the critical moment. Catalina's memory did not improve with rest. The absence persisted, unresponsive to effort. By evening, the implications had begun to extend beyond the house. Messages arrived from acquaintances expressing polite concern disguised as curiosity. The presence of a foreign noblewoman within Northmoor House did not go unnoticed. Henry deflected inquiries without confirmation, maintaining discretion while recognizing the fragility of control. Catalina, unaware of the full scope of external attention, remained focused inward. Her memory remained fractured, selective in retention, yet firm in what it preserved. The imbalance suggested not loss, but obstruction. Something prevented access rather than erased content. The realization unsettled her. As night returned to Grosvenor Square, the situation remained unresolved. The woman who had collapsed in public now occupied a private space with consequences extending far beyond its walls. Her identity was known. Her purpose was not. The absence of explanation transformed concern into anticipation. And within that anticipation, the certainty emerged that the answers, when they arrived, would not remain contained. By the second day of Catalina's stay, Northmoor House had begun to behave like a fortress under quiet siege. Nothing dramatic occurred in the corridors. No obvious conflict erupted in the drawing rooms, yet the structure of the household subtly reshaped itself around a single fact. A foreign noblewoman was living under the roof of an unmarried duke, and London had already begun to treat that fact as entertainment. Snow continued to fall across Grosvenor Square, softening the city's edges while sharpening its rumours. Carriage wheels carved dark tracks through slush. Messengers moved faster than the weather, and gossip moved faster than messengers. The fair in Berkeley Square had been a public stage. The rescue had been witnessed. The abrupt departure in a private carriage had been observed. The story did not require details to spread, only a suggestion. Northmoor House responded, as it always did, to external pressure with discipline. Henderson reinforced control of access without appearing to. The staff became more selective in admitting visitors. Notes were received and answered with calculated brevity. Deliveries were managed with greater caution. The household maintained its ordinary rhythm, but the rhythm became a performance designed to communicate stability. Catalina, meanwhile, existed inside that stability as both guest and disruption. Her condition improved physically. Her strength returned. Her appetite remained modest but no longer absent. She moved through the house with increasing confidence, though always within boundaries that preserved propriety. Mrs. Davies remained a consistent presence, close enough to satisfy expectation without making Catalina feel restrained. The housekeeper's supervision was practical rather than intrusive, an arrangement that allowed Catalina freedom while ensuring the household could answer any accusation with certainty. Memory, however, did not follow the same pattern of recovery. Catalina retained her identity, her upbringing, her language, her family name, her homeland. She remembered travelling to England, arriving in London, and registering at Claridge's. She remembered her companion Elena, though the circumstances surrounding Elena's absence at Berkeley Square remained blank. The purpose of the journey stayed inaccessible. The mind, it seemed, held the truth behind a locked door. Henry Ashbourne maintained distance in the ways he could. He ensured Catalina's needs were met, but he did not hover. He visited briefly, asked what was necessary, retreated back into his routine. The strategy was clear. Contain the disruption, avoid emotional investment, prevent the household from becoming a narrative that London could shape into scandal. Yet even as he attempted this, the reality resisted containment. The longer Catalina remained, the more her presence became an established fact. An established fact invited interpretation. By the third day, the interpretation had fully formed outside the house. Letters arrived from acquaintances disguised as polite concern. Invitations appeared suddenly, offered with artificial warmth. framed as opportunities for Catalina to be properly introduced to English society. Such invitations carried obvious motives: to see her, to judge her, to claim first-hand knowledge of the situation. Henry declined them without hesitation. A separate category of correspondence was more aggressive. A request came from the Duchess of Fairmont's household, phrased as a polite inquiry into the health of the indisposed lady. Another note referenced the incident at Berkeley Square more directly, suggesting that London would be reassured if the Duke clarified matters before creative minds created their own version. Henry responded with silence. In London, silence was never interpreted as innocence, but it remained safer than contradiction. Catalina did not initially understand the scale of attention. She knew that her presence in the Duke's house carried social weight. She understood basic structures of English propriety, but she underestimated how quickly a story could be weaponized by society, especially when foreignness and nobility were involved. When Henry avoided visitors and dismissed inquiries, she interpreted it as efficient protection of her privacy rather than defense against attack. The first internal shift occurred when Elena arrived. She came not with urgency, but with performance. Her relief appeared rehearsed. Her apology was inadequate. Her explanation was vague. She claimed she had been drawn away at the fair by an insistent nobleman who requested her assistance in selecting fabric. She framed the incident as unavoidable and implied that refusing would have been socially dangerous. The logic collapsed under scrutiny. If Elena was assigned to chaperone Catalina, abandonment was not a minor mistake. It was a failure with potential consequences severe enough to compromise Catalina's reputation permanently. Henry recognized this immediately. Catalina did as well, though she responded differently. Her frustration emerged, but loyalty softened it. Eleanor was familiar. Familiarity often overpowered judgment. Henry refused to accept the explanation. He did not berate Eleanor openly. He did not create a scene. Instead, he imposed a solution. Catalina would remain in Northmore House until her health and memory stabilized, supervised by a household that could guarantee propriety. Elena, who lacked both competence and authority, accepted the arrangement with suspicious ease. The acceptance suggested either relief at avoiding responsibility or an underlying motive that had yet to surface. With Elena present, the atmosphere shifted again. Now, there was an official companion, even if she was unreliable. That made Catalina's continued stay easier to justify, but it did not dissolve suspicion. In fact, it offered society a new angle. If Catalina had a chaperone, then her continued proximity to Henry could be framed as deliberate rather than accidental. The narrative became more dangerous, not less. Within the house, another force arrived that Catalina did not anticipate. Lady Margaret Thornbury entered Northmore House as if she owned it, which in a sense she did. She was family. She did not request permission. She announced her presence through momentum. Her arrival was not quiet. Her purpose was clear. She intended to assess the situation personally and ensure her brother was not ruining his life out of stubbornness or misguided honor. Margaret's first impression of Catalina was immediate and revealing. She did not treat Catalina as an inconvenience or threat. She treated her as a person. Warmth replaced calculation. Curiosity replaced suspicion. Margaret's intelligence manifested in her ability to read tension and choose to reduce it rather than inflame it. The dynamic altered quickly. Margaret and Catalina found common ground with surprising ease. They shared a preference for direct assessment over polite deception. They observed English society with similar skepticism, though from different angles. Catalina's foreign perspective sharpened the critique. Margaret's experience supplied internal knowledge. Together, they created a pattern Henry could not control: laughter. For Henry, the shift was destabilizing. His life had been engineered to minimize unpredictability. Laughter was unpredictable. It changed rooms. It changed the pace of time. It made people linger. It made patterns form where none had existed before. He found himself drawn into conversation more frequently, not because he sought it, but because avoiding it began to feel unnatural. Catalina's presence became less medical and more personal. Her strength returned enough for small walks through the gardens, supervised closely. The snow made the grounds appear peaceful, but even the gardens carried risk. A duke and a foreign lady strolling together, even with servants nearby, could be described as intimacy by anyone motivated to describe it that way. Margaret noticed everything. She observed Henry's attention shifting. She noted Catalina's increasing ease. She recognized the subtle change in Henry's posture when Catalina entered a room. These were not dramatic signs, but they were undeniable. Margaret did not announce her conclusions directly. She applied pressure through implication and timing, ensuring Henry could not ignore what was developing. Catalina, meanwhile, remained caught between two realities. One was external, the social danger, the fragile state of her reputation, the looming need to return to her life in England and fulfill whatever purpose brought her there. The other was internal, an emerging sense of comfort in Northmoor House. A comfort she had not expected and could not easily explain. The house represented stability, but the person who represented it most was not the staff, not the structure, not the rituals. It was Henry. The memory lock persisted. Catalina attempted to force it at intervals, concentrating, retracing the journey, searching for the missing purpose. Fragments surfaced without coherence. Her father's study in Spain, documents on a desk, the weight of obligation. Elena's anxious excitement, a sense of pressure that tightened like a collar. But the central explanation remained out of reach. Henry noticed the effort. He did not comment openly, but his attention sharpened whenever Catalina's expression shifted into frustration. He learned her patterns quickly, the way she went still when searching her mind, the way her gaze fixed on nothing when trying to retrieve what had been lost. He offered structure without pushing, suggesting rest and routine rather than interrogation. The approach was restrained, yet it communicated a form of concern that did not feel performative. By the end of the third day, the house had achieved a fragile equilibrium. Elena remained useless but present. Margaret remained amused and watchful. Catalina remained recovering but unsettled. Henry remained controlled but increasingly implicated. Outside, London continued to construct its own version of events, a version that grew louder with each hour of silence. Then Christmas Day arrived with a change no one in Northmoor House could contain. Early in the morning, Henderson delivered an interruption with unusual urgency. Foreign gentlemen had arrived at the door, insisting on immediate access to Lady Catalina. Their tone was not polite, their demand was not negotiable, their identity was presented with certainty. They claimed to be family. The announcement altered the atmosphere instantly. Family meant authority, family meant consequences, family meant the end of any controlled delay. Henry moved quickly. But speed did not restore control. The household shifted from quiet management to active containment, attempting to prevent the scene from spilling into public view. The men were admitted into the entrance hall. They carried travel weariness without diminishing their intensity. Their expressions communicated anger, suspicion, and resolve. The oldest among them stood forward, his posture rigid with aristocratic certainty. His eyes fixed on Henry without deference, as though Henry's title meant nothing against what he believed had happened. He identified himself as Don Fernando de Monteayor, Marquis of Valcazar, Catalina's father. The name alone carried implication. A Spanish marquis was not in London for social amusement. He was there for retrieval. He was there for control. His presence suggested that Catalina's journey to England had not been casual, not voluntary, and not easily abandoned. Before Henry could shape the encounter into formality, another man stepped forward, younger, fair-haired, and sharpened by a different kind of entitlement. His position beside the Marquis suggested alliance rather than subordination. His gaze moved through the hall, as if searching for property rather than a person. He asserted his own identity with equal certainty. He was Lord Purcell Harrington, and he demanded Catalina not as a missing guest, but as someone owed to him. The title he implied was not friendship, not acquaintance, not family. It was claim. As the words settled into the air, footsteps sounded above. Catalina appeared at the top of the staircase, drawn by the tension she could not interpret from a distance. She wore borrowed clothing, her hair not yet arranged, her posture still fragile from recovery. She looked down into a hall occupied by unfamiliar men whose presence felt hostile. She did not recognize them at first. The Marquis's expression shifted when he saw her, hardening into something more personal, something that carried both anger and fear. The younger man's posture tightened, his gaze focusing with possession rather than relief. The atmosphere became heavier in a way that no household discipline could dilute. Catalina began to descend, confusion sharpening into unease as she approached. Her father's voice, his language, his certainty reached toward her like an anchor. The familiarity forced recognition into place. Catalina slowed. Her hand found the banister instinctively. The sudden pressure in her expression suggested not only recognition, but the beginning of memory returning in a painful surge. Then the final statement was delivered, not as speculation, but as fact. Catalina was not merely a visitor in England. She was not merely traveling. She was engaged. The wedding date was specific, fixed, and imminent. And as Catalina processed the claim, her body swayed in the same way it had at Berkeley Square, as if the truth itself carried weight. Henry moved without hesitation to steady her. Catalina's gaze lifted toward him, and in that moment her expression shifted from confusion into something far more dangerous, something that suggested memory not only returning, but returning with consequences. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound emerged. The entrance hall remained silent, frozen around a single realization. The events of Christmas Eve had not merely caused scandal, they had interrupted an arrangement powerful men intended to enforce, and whatever Catalina had forgotten was about to resurface in full, whether she wanted it to or not. The entrance hall of Northmoor House ceased to function as a domestic space and became something closer to a tribunal. The architecture that usually communicated order and permanence now amplified tension, its high ceilings and rigid symmetry holding every movement in sharp relief. Snowlight filtered faintly through the tall windows, illuminating a confrontation that no amount of household discipline could soften. Catalina stood supported by Henry's arm, her balance compromised not by weakness alone, but by recognition. Memory, long obstructed, had begun to force its way back with unwelcome clarity. The presence of her father, the authority in his posture, the controlled anger in his gaze, all acted as keys turning simultaneously. The fragments that had resisted access for days aligned abruptly. The journey to England was no longer abstract. It had been planned, deliberate, and binding. Her father's arrival carried more than concern. It carried intent. The younger man beside him, positioned not as a guest but as an equal participant, reinforced that intent. The way he observed Catalina suggested expectation rather than relief, possession rather than worry. The meaning of his presence became unavoidable. Catalina's engagement was not an allegation. It was an established arrangement. The realization altered the dynamic instantly. What had previously appeared as a domestic irregularity now revealed itself as an interruption. The collapse at Berkeley Square was no longer an isolated medical incident. It was an event that had displaced a sequence of actions carefully constructed by others. Henry recognized this shift immediately. Until that moment, he had framed the situation as a matter of propriety and responsibility. A woman had collapsed, assistance had been necessary, care had followed. The arrival of Catalina's father reframed everything. This was no longer about rescue alone. It was about interference. The men did not waste time. Catalina was identified as the daughter of a Spanish marquis. The arrangement was formal, negotiated, and concluded months earlier. Her intended marriage was not speculative. Contracts existed, dates had been secured, obligations extended beyond personal preference and into financial and political alignment. Catalina listened as the information settled, her expression tightening with each confirmation. Her memory completed its return with precision rather than mercy. She recalled her father's study in Seville, the documents laid out with care, the emphasis on necessity rather than desire. She remembered being told that the arrangement was beneficial, that resistance would be impractical, that acceptance would secure stability for the family. She remembered agreeing, not out of conviction, but out of exhaustion. The pressure she had felt at the fair now made sense. It had not been random weakness, it had been the body responding to confinement before the mind. Could articulate refusal. The collapse had been a failure of endurance, not health. Henry observed the transformation with growing clarity. Catalina's posture shifted as memory returned, her confusion replaced by restraint. The change was subtle but unmistakable. She no longer searched for answers. She braced for consequences. The difference unsettled him more than uncertainty had. The men spoke with confidence, as though resolution was inevitable. Plans were referenced, schedules confirmed. The interruption was framed as unfortunate but manageable. Catalina's recovery was acknowledged only to the extent that it did not disrupt the existing arrangement. The assumption underlying every statement was consistent. Catalina's role was to comply. Henry intervened. His approach remained controlled, but his position hardened. He introduced the physician's assessment, noting Catalina's condition and the impact of memory loss. He suggested reconsideration, not cancellation. Even this measured objection was met with dismissal. The response was immediate and revealing. Catalina's health was deemed irrelevant. The arrangement, once made, superseded individual discomfort. Delays were characterized as dangerous, not because of Catalina's well-being, but because of perception. Scandal, the men implied, would grow more damaging the longer the situation remained unresolved. Catalina, who had remained silent, asserted herself. Her interruption shifted attention abruptly. The act of claiming her presence in the discussion disrupted the established hierarchy. She did not raise her voice. She did not plead. She simply demanded recognition as a participant rather than an object. The men reacted with visible surprise. Henry used the moment to ask a question no one else had been willing to articulate. He directed it not at the contracts, not at the arrangements, but at Catalina herself. He asked whether she wished to proceed with the marriage that had been planned for her. The question destabilized the room. It introduced a variable that the arrangement had not accounted for. Consent, when acknowledged, complicated authority. The response was immediate resistance. The older men dismissed the relevance of personal desire. Agreements had been made, signatures secured, wishes were secondary to obligation. Catalina struggled for clarity. She searched for certainty within herself, but certainty remained elusive. She knew what she did not want, but what she wanted felt dangerous to name. The collapse of the engagement in that moment would carry consequences she was not prepared to calculate. Before she could respond, the younger man intervened. His participation altered the confrontation more than Henry's objection had. He spoke not with the authority of inheritance, but with a clarity that suggested long-suppressed dissatisfaction. He acknowledged the arrangement, but questioned its legitimacy. He recognized Catalina's uncertainty as evidence rather than inconvenience. His refusal was deliberate. He rejected the premise that marriage could proceed without mutual intention. He recognized the imbalance inherent in the arrangement and named it without defensiveness. His position undermined the authority of the contracts more effectively than any external challenge could have. The response from his father was swift and severe. Threats of disinheritance were deployed without restraint. The consequences were framed as inevitable and irreversible. The young man absorbed them without retreat. The refusal stood. The confrontation shifted again. Catalina observed the exchange with conflicted relief. The pressure that had enclosed her began to fracture, though the release was incomplete. The refusal of the engagement did not equate to freedom. It merely removed one constraint, leaving others intact. The men withdrew in stages. The Marquis declared his intention to retrieve his daughter and contain the damage. The refusal of the marriage did not eliminate the need for resolution. Catalina's presence in Northmoor House remained a liability to be managed. As the group dispersed, the house fell into an unfamiliar silence. Catalina remained standing, her composure held by effort rather than calm. The memory that had returned now carried weight. She understood the consequences of what had occurred and the magnitude of what remained unresolved. Henry approached cautiously. He did not frame his intervention as heroism or obligation. He spoke in terms of choice and consequence. He acknowledged the disruption without claiming ownership of it. His suggestion emerged from practicality rather than impulse. Marriage would neutralize scandal, restore balance, and protect Catalina from further coercion. Catalina resisted immediately. She recognized the intention beneath the proposal, and it unsettled her. Protection, without desire, replicated the structure she had just escaped. She refused to replace one arrangement with another, regardless of its apparent benefit. Henry adjusted. He clarified his position with precision. The offer was not solely strategic. The days spent in proximity had altered his assessment of what constituted acceptable risk. The attraction he had attempted to suppress had become unmistakable. The restraint he valued no longer aligned with the reality before him. Catalina listened without interruption. Her response was measured. She acknowledged the connection but refused to conflate it with certainty. The choice, if made, would require conditions that ensured autonomy. Rather than exchange, she would not submit to a decision framed as rescue. She required partnership, transparency, and accountability. Henry accepted the conditions without hesitation. The acceptance itself altered the balance again. For the first time since her arrival in England, Catalina perceived an option that did not depend on obligation. Alone, the possibility carried risk, but it also carried agency. The confrontation with her father remained unresolved. That resolution could not be delayed indefinitely. Authority demanded acknowledgement. Catalina insisted that any decision be presented openly without concealment or coercion. Henry agreed, recognizing that secrecy would undermine legitimacy. As evening approached, Northmoor House absorbed the aftermath. The staff adjusted without inquiry. Margaret observed without comment, recognizing the significance of restraint. Elena remained peripheral, her role diminished by irrelevance. Outside, London continued to speculate. Inside, a decision formed without final shape. Catalina stood at the threshold of choice with full awareness of its cost. The arrangement that had defined her path was no longer enforceable, but the alternative demanded courage rather than compliance. Henry's presence offered stability, but not certainty. The future remained undefined. What had begun as an interruption had evolved into a reckoning, and As night settled over Grosvenor Square once more, the realization solidified that whatever resolution followed would not restore the previous order. It would replace it entirely. Northmoor House entered a period of suspended normality. After the confrontation in the entrance hall, no clear authority remained to dictate the next step, yet no one believed the matter resolved. The house itself seemed to recognize the shift. Corridors that once reflected routine now carried anticipation. Time slowed, not from inactivity, but from the awareness that any movement forward would be irreversible. Catalina remained within the East Wing for most of the afternoon, not out of weakness, but necessity. The return of her memory had stabilized her identity while destabilizing her future. She no longer questioned who she was or how she had arrived in England. Those facts were now firmly restored. What remained uncertain was what authority she possessed over what came next. The arrangement her father had constructed was no longer abstract. It was tangible, documented, defended by men who understood power as something transferred rather than chosen. Catalina now understood the full scope of what she had been expected to accept. The collapse at Berkeley Square appeared less like misfortune and more like interruption, a moment in which her body had rejected a decision her voice had never fully supported. Henry Ashbourne observed the aftermath from a different position. For the first time in his life, restraint felt insufficient. His instinct had always been to preserve order by minimizing exposure. This situation resisted that approach. The presence of Catalina's family had revealed a network of obligations that did not dissolve through silence. If left unattended, those obligations would reassert themselves with greater force. He understood what was at stake. If Catalina returned to her father without resolution, the narrative would be rewritten without her consent. The interruption would be reframed as instability. The engagement, though challenged, would be reimposed under a different justification. London's interest would amplify the pressure rather than diminish it. Protection through distance was no longer viable. Henry requested a private audience with Don Fernando before departure arrangements were finalized. The request was not framed as negotiation, but clarification. The Marquis accepted with visible reluctance. The meeting was held in the smaller drawing room, away from staff and without witnesses whose presence might distort intent. The exchange was restrained, but uncompromising. Don Fernando emphasized authority, lineage, and consequence. He acknowledged the disruption, but rejected the premise that it altered the underlying structure of the arrangement. His daughter's safety and reputation, he argued, required decisive containment. Delay invited speculation. Speculation invited damage. Henry responded with precision rather than challenge. He presented the reality of English society, the permanence of rumour, and the insufficiency of denial. Catalina's continued movement under compulsion would not restore her reputation. It would confirm suspicion. Resolution required legitimacy, not force. The Marquis dismissed the argument initially. Legitimacy, in his view, had already been secured through contract. Consent, while preferable, was not essential. The distinction between agreement and acceptance carried little weight. Within the framework, he recognized. Catalina joined the meeting before it concluded. Her entrance altered the balance immediately. She did not seek permission. She did not request protection. She stated her position with clarity, shaped by exhaustion rather than emotion. The arrangement had been agreed to under pressure. That pressure had produced a collapse. She would not proceed under similar conditions again. Her father attempted reassurance, then correction. Catalina resisted both. She articulated the cost of compliance in terms that could not be dismissed as immaturity. The life proposed for her had been designed for stability, not fulfillment. She acknowledged the benefits while rejecting the premise that benefit alone justified surrender. The Marquis recognized the shift. What he faced now was not indecision, but refusal supported by clarity. The pressure that had once ensured compliance no longer functioned. Catalina's certainty, though fragile, was genuine. Henry intervened only once. He stated his intention without embellishment. Marriage, if undertaken, would be immediate and public. It would neutralize scandal, secure Catalina's autonomy within English law, and render external coercion ineffective. The offer was not conditional upon obedience. It was structured to remove leverage from those who would apply it. The Marquis interpreted the proposal as provocation. He questioned Henry's motives, suggesting impulsiveness rather than responsibility. He implied that desire, however sincere, did not equate to suitability. Henry did not deny the risk. He acknowledged it. He framed the choice not as certainty, but as willingness to assume consequence. Catalina did not respond immediately. She considered the implications with care. Acceptance would end the arrangement imposed upon her, but it would replace it with another equally binding. The difference lay not in permanence, but in origin. One decision had been negotiated without her voice. The other required it entirely. She imposed conditions. The marriage would not be presented as rescue. It would be acknowledged as choice. She would retain agency over her future role. Her relationship with her father would not be severed through secrecy. The decision would be confronted openly, without retreat or apology. Henry accepted without reservation. The acceptance altered the Marquis's assessment. What he now observed was not impulsive defiance, but coordinated resolve. The implications extended beyond scandal. Refusal to acknowledge the decision would escalate rather than contain damage. Reluctantly, Don Fernando recalibrated. He set conditions of his own, not as leverage, but as acknowledgement of loss. The marriage would proceed immediately to prevent further speculation. Catalina would maintain connection to her family. The transition would be public enough to establish legitimacy without inviting excess scrutiny. The agreement was reached without celebration. Northmoor House shifted into motion. Arrangements were executed with efficiency born of necessity. A special license was secured through established channels. The household staff adapted seamlessly, treating the development as urgent but not extraordinary. The chapel on the estate was prepared with minimal ornamentation. Witnesses were limited, time compressed. Catalina observed the preparations with measured detachment. The speed prevented doubt from developing into paralysis. The cadeau, absence of spectacle, preserved focus. The decision, though sudden, felt aligned rather than reactive. Her awareness sharpened rather than blurred. Henry remained outwardly composed. Internally, the magnitude of the decision expanded with each completed arrangement. The structure of his life, long defined by avoidance of precisely this kind of risk, was being dismantled by deliberate choice. The clarity surprised him more than the fear. The ceremony proceeded without deviation. It was brief, restrained, and final. Documentation was completed. Signatures affixed. The legal transformation occurred without drama. Catalina de Monteayor became Duchess of Northmoor by law, not by concession. These implications took hold immediately. The Marquis departed with visible restraint, carrying acceptance rather than satisfaction. The household resumed function under new parameters. Messages were dispatched to relevant parties, framing the event with controlled transparency. London would respond in its own time. Within the house, the atmosphere did not resolve into relief. It settled into vigilance. The marriage neutralized one threat while inviting others. Attention would intensify rather than recede. Interpretation would multiply. Catalina and Henry remained aware of this. Their union had not concluded the sequence of events. It had redirected it. The forces that had shaped the arrangement would not dissipate quietly. They would adapt, reassess, and respond. As evening returned to Grosvenor Square, Northmoor House stood altered but unbroken. What had begun as an interruption had now become a declaration. The consequences had yet to fully surface. Outside, the city prepared to rewrite the story. Inside, the awareness remained that control had not been reclaimed, only transferred. And as the household settled into an unfamiliar configuration, the certainty emerged that the true reckoning would not come from what had already occurred, but from how the world would respond once the silence broke.